Well, thank you very much indeed, Martin, and welcome again to what I think is going to be a very different public sector summit. And what I want to do this morning in this opening session is to provide a framework for the diversity of the presentations and discussions that are going to engage us over the next couple of days. I've got to say, I start from a strong belief that the implications of the matters discussed are going to have profound ramifications for public services and their leadership, for you, for us. Certainly, we meet in the knowledge that yet another wave of public sector reform is underway. As Les reminded us last night, the PM announced back in September of last year a commitment to a long-range blueprint for a world-class 21st century public service, led, as Les reminded us, by Terry Moran in PM&C, and now I understand nearing completion. And I understand with some significant emphasis being placed on citizen engagement. In Western Australia, the Economic Audit, of which I was a member, focused much of its attention on the need for significant public sector reform and greater community influence on government. And there's a similar focus in many states, and also, of course, in other democracies, whether modelled on Westminster or Washington, whether parliamentary or presidential in their structure, which is why I think the insights of our overseas speakers is going to be of such value. Indeed, in the United Kingdom, as we'll learn later this morning, the state of the civil service and the need for its substantive overhaul is a major matter for political debate heading towards an imminent election. On the Labour side, Alan Milburn, who was out here last year, has argued that public services today are in transition between a 20th century model and a 21st century one, from one characterised by state control, monopoly provision and provider-dominated culture, to one where the citizen is in control. On the Conservative side, David Cameron has argued for a massive, sweeping, radical redistribution of power, from the state to citizens, from Whitehall to communities, from bureaucracy to democracy. It is such bold visions which I anticipate will capture our imagination in the next couple of days. Now understand, I'm not asking us to suspend our critical faculties or to forsake the deeply embedded pragmatism that often comes from our long experience. But I do hope we're going to seize the opportunity to look beyond, perhaps far beyond, the parameters that we normally set in our strategic conversations on public sector reform. This is not a conference that is intended to constrain discourse within the immediate and concrete issues on which public sector conferences so often entirely appropriately focus. Indeed, I was going to say, somewhat disparagingly, that this is not a conference which will direct its attention to increasing the organisational capacity of the public services, not a conference that will focus on how to upgrade the quality of policy advice and the provision of services to successive governments, or the cost-effectiveness of programme delivery, or raising service standards, or improving the quality of the recruitment and the career development and the leadership of the public sector. But in fact, such a statement would be profoundly wrong. The conference is about those issues. The difference is that the starting point for us today is not on public sector reform per se. It is, as we'll see, on promoting public innovation, on resuscitating democracy, on promoting open and transparent government, on exploring new approaches to citizen engagement, on acting collectively for the common good. And this boldness of direction will provide a level of intellectual freedom and daring that will feed the discussions we'll be having. When I look at the structure of the 2 days, I'm pretty sure we're going to be talking about how to re-articulate the relationship between the state and its citizenry, how to empower communities and individuals and the organisations that represent their views and their interests, how to rebuild trust in government, in parliaments and public institutions, how to promote innovation for public good and for community purpose and for social impact, how to enhance the capacity of social media to revitalise democratic discourse and advocacy and participation. And I've got to tell you, I really don't know how all this is going to unfold over the next couple of days. It's the delightful risk that we've got to manage together. But my limited powers of foresight do suggest that the implications of these questions for the organisational capacity of public services and the leadership they require is going to be far more radical than if we had started by asking those questions directly. So let me reflect briefly on why the matters that we'll discuss are just so important to me personally. I was, as you know, a public servant for 20 years. I enjoyed it immensely. I found it, as do so many of you, intellectually rewarding and demanding. It was nice to work on matters of public importance that had consequences not just for tomorrow or next year, but for our children and our grandchildren. Had the chance to work on, for example, multicultural policy, on the response to native title, on higher education reform, on the delivery of labour market programs, even, I say quietly, drafting a framework of an emissions trading scheme. Now, in truth, as many of you will know, I didn't exactly serve quietly. Within the limits of what was appropriate for an apolitical and impartial public servant, I did use my authority to speak out forcefully on the need for ongoing public service reform and change. I tried, in a way, to lead from the front. But, in my last 18 months in PM&C, I increasingly came to recognise that what interested me, because it so concerned me, was not just the state of the public service, but the future of participatory democratic governance in the modern state. And that was the issue that led me increasingly to appreciate the role of not-for-profit organisations and their potential to be partners in new forms of governance. Beyond the valleys of despond and despair, I actually saw the light of hope. I came to recognise that as trust in governments has fallen, as party political membership has declined, as, where voting is voluntary, rates of political turnout have plummeted, there was nevertheless a new politics of purpose emerging stronger than ever at the grassroots level. Whether face-to-face or online, I discovered a revitalisation of engagement, which, if only it could be harnessed, could become the foundations of a more engaged democracy. I'm talking here not just about new forms of community advocacy and explicitly political action, though that's very, very important. No, what I'm really talking about here is the increasing number of Australians who sustain 600,000 Australian not-for-profit organisations through joining and funding them. I'm talking about the rising force of voluntary engagement. I'm speaking of activities, whether in the neighbourhood or in the blogosphere, that are driven by community purpose. I suspect many of the people who participate would be surprised, they might even be outraged, if I was describing their activities as political. And yet to me, running a tennis club or a school tuck shop, joining a society to watch birds or spot trains or protect heritage or sing in choirs or restore riverbanks, visiting breast cancer patients in hospital or delivering meals to the elderly or showering people with a disability. These community initiatives, as they create the networks of civil society, as they do things rather for themselves rather than relying on the state, are, in my perception, influencing political agendas in powerful ways. So I've been outside the APS now for 2 years working at the Centre for Social Impact. It's given me time to reflect on what I did and did not achieve as a public servant. And perhaps, not surprisingly, I now realise that what I learnt most from, what now drives my ideas, what sustains my energy, are not the modest successes I enjoyed as a public servant, but the manifold failures I endured. These are failures I attribute generally not to slothfulness, not necessarily to short-sightedness, not even, although it was more frequent, to stuff-ups. My failures, I think, reflected the fact that I didn't adequately understand or address the systemic dysfunctionalities that too often turn the very best of political and public service intentions into the very worst of policy outcomes. In other words, my failures were only partly personal. Frequently, they reflected the institutional structures and the cultural mores of the governance within which I worked. So, let you be the very first audience to share the insights of the book that I'll probably never write. But I have got a title, and because it's designed to appeal to an academic audience, it includes a colon, postscript to history, colon, Memoirs of a Failed Public Servant. I emphasise that the title has no question mark. And here's the executive summary. The public service in which I served for 2 decades was one in which managerialism held sway. From outside, in Australia and overseas, it was, of course, often articulated as new public management. Both terms, of course, are not neutral. Usually they carry a weight of critical opprobrium. In Australia, at least, the reforms in which I participated, sometimes led, were often ascribed to a neoliberal agenda driven by public service economic rationalists and market enthusiasts. Well, I don't know about you, but from the inside, it seemed far less ideological. While it did involve contracting out service delivery under a purchaser-provider model, while it did involve the creation of markets for public goods, for me, I'm pretty sure for many of my colleagues, I'm pretty sure for many of you, the focus was actually on getting results and removing unnecessary prescription of process. It was about improving resource allocation across government and better measuring our outcomes and our outputs and ensuring value for money from public funds. In New Zealand, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in the United States, in Singapore and the Netherlands, to my certain knowledge, and in every state and territory with different emphases and varying degrees of enthusiasm, there was this similar process underway from the late 1980s through the 1990s up to the present time. It is a time of change. But perhaps because of a lack of political courage, or public service enthusiasm, or strategic vision, the reforms seem to me to be ending more with a whimper than a bang. The big 4 failures, although the starkness was not apparent to me at the time, were in the very areas in which change seemed most pronounced. So let's go through those. Number 1, program delivery, something very close to the heart of the Rudd government right now. Now, I think most of you will know that I really cared about delivery. It's why I established a cabinet implementation unit in PM&C. I believed that we needed to deliver government programs on time, on budget, to government expectations. I said over and over, look, policy delivery is just as important as policy development. And yet, you know, I got diverted. I got diverted into project management and traffic light reports and gateway reviews, all of which are very important. But there were more profound issues which I think deserve our greater attention. First, how to ensure that the real-world experience of regional offices and operational agencies and frontline public servants actually gets incorporated into the development and the design of policy. Second, how to harness the insight and the wisdom of service deliverers and community activists into program design from outside the public service. And third, how to allow those who receive services to actually tailor them to their own specific needs. So improved program delivery, I now comprehend, requires far more fundamental redesign than most governments and most public services have been willing to introduce. Second big issue was service quality. It's not surprising, given my focus on the need to deliver policy on time and on budget and to government expectations, etc., that I believed in the importance of service standard. In truth, I always thought that the proclamation of standards through citizen charters was, like many of our genuflections to citizen-centric services, more spin than substance. The standards were nearly all decided top-down. They focused on process. They rarely set aspirational goals or stretch targets, and they had little, if any, enforceability. Most importantly, I lost. I lost the public battle I waged against treating citizens as customers. And I still believe this characterisation has been damaging in misinterpreting the very substance of democratic governance. Pretty clear what happened. Driven by a desire to extol the public sector's improved commitment to service, we then appropriated the language of the private sector so that governments and their public services, as a result, fail to recognise the profound difference between the customer who seeks a mortgage from the Commonwealth Bank to the citizen who seeks a New Start payment from Centrelink. Yet the difference is absolutely fundamental. The citizen rarely has a choice of whether they want to receive a service or not. And even with outsourcing, they rarely have a genuine choice of provider. More importantly, the citizen's rights to services come with responsibilities. Their entitlements come with obligations. And a failure to understand this undermines our understanding of governance and the way it needs to be transformed. The third big issue was, of course, joined-up government. As head of PM&C, I've got to say I talked relentlessly for 5 years on the need to overcome the barriers of officialdom and bureaucratic territoriality and administrative demarcations and the silos of communication. I established cross-sectoral agencies to develop key policy initiatives in a way that brought together central line and operational agencies. I even managed to include participants from outside the public service on the inside of policy development. Through planning and practice, I think Commonwealth and state governments did become far more adept at dealing quickly and efficiently with crises, whether they were natural disasters like the Asian tsunami, Cyclone Larry, or terrorist attacks, such as we experienced in Bali and Jakarta. That's the good news. The bad news is that one only has to look at the appalling state of Indigenous affairs to realise how, in spite of goodwill and ardent effort on behalf of many, many public servants, it was almost impossible to drive an effective whole-of-government response, for example, to the needs of remote Aboriginal communities. I tried with only the most limited, paltry success to drive the most basic of shared responsibility agreements with communities so that Commonwealth and state and territory governments could work with Indigenous communities using discretionary money on just a couple of negotiated initiatives at the local level. I put huge amounts of effort in. It was remarkably difficult to get any genuine traction and to keep the traction going. The fact is that the APS in which I worked, the public services in which you work, do the big things very efficiently and effectively and generally ethically, making tax returns, for example, or delivering welfare benefits. But I've got to say that I think public services are pretty hopeless and getting worse at joining up initiatives on a small scale at the local level in response to community needs. Sadly, I think the public services within which we work are designed and function best on an industrial scale. The structures and workplace systems are built for mass production of services, delivered in large volumes, within flexible structures of authority and decision-making to ensure quality control. Public services are, I think, generally uneasy about the concept of neighbourhood. And the fourth big issue, of course, was outsourcing. So let me be clear. Often I would sit the other side of the table from my colleague, Shergold Curnow, arguing in the Senate about the value and the problems of outsourcing. I was an enthusiast for the contracting out of human service delivery to not-for-profit community-based organisations. In a way, I still am. I love the period in which I had the oversight of Job Network, or Job Services Australia as it is now. But I've got to tell you, at its most profound level, I think outsourcing has failed. See, it seems to me that outsourcing has three advantages. One is cost effectiveness. And on that, I've got to say, on the whole, it's delivered. In part, how ironic is this? Because community organisations too often end up subsidising government through paying their staff lower wages, through using volunteer labour, through using their tax advantages and directing their donations and other income to government ends. But government, on the whole, has got cost effectiveness. The second big hope of outsourcing was to improve service delivery. And in general, I think that's also been achieved. You know, not-for-profit organisations, their boards, their managers, their employees do generally care about those to whom they deliver services. That's why so often they advocate on their behalf. They have a level of empathy that is not generally evident in public services. So give that a tick too. But look, why I thought outsourcing was so important was for a third reason. Because it would actually promote social innovation. If I had 200 different Job Network members, half from the private sector, half from the community sector, delivering employment services, wouldn't it be great? They'd all do things in their different ways, we'd share best practice. We buggered it up. Now, I know Cheryl and I both agree that Meatloaf is one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. And you may remember, if you're as old as I am, that he sang, "I want you, I need you, but I'm never going to love you, but 2 out of 3 ain't bad." Well, I've got to tell you on this, I reckon 2 out of 3 is awful. We failed to gather what should have been the real possibilities of outsourcing, the innovative risk-taking that so often accompanies community mission. And it's driven by the fact that community organisations always have ambitions that far outstrip their resources. That community innovation has too often been crushed by the dead hand of public service control and risk aversion. At the heart of the challenge lies ambiguity of governance, which is often reflected in service agreements, and I've read lots of these service agreements in the last 12 months. And as I read them, there is very, very often a lack of clarity about whether the government funding is intended to be a subsidy for the provision of community services, or whether it's meant to be government funding to pay for the delivery of government services. And I have interviewed community leaders and public servants on both sides of these service agreements, and they interpret it differently. So, I reiterate, even as a public servant, I was aware of these issues. This is not that sort of retirement has brought revelation. This is not something I have discovered on the path to Torquay. The problem on reflection was this. For much of my time in the APS, I saw these challenges and others as ones that the public services with government support needed to address. Only too late did I come fully to recognise that to see the answer to public service reform lying exclusively within the institution was inevitably doomed to failure. Only belatedly did I adequately appreciate that the future of public services needed to be framed within a more collaborative approach to governance, and to understand how bold were the changes that were required. So I began to look at new frameworks of network governance, in which not only the delivery of government but the directions of government are co-produced by citizens, formally through not-for-profit organisations and social enterprises, informally by communities of place or interest, individually by those who receive the service. I simply don't believe that a programme of continuous improvement within the public services is going to be sufficient to the public service reform that is required, unless the broader issue of governance is addressed. The fact is that effective government policy increasingly depends upon the active engagement of citizens, and public services, for good or for bad, will be the intermediaries. From where I stand now, it seems to me that the democratic government of the early 21st century faces two giant challenges. The first is how to address the substantial pockets of social exclusion which survive the best endeavours of welfare state paternalism and which threaten to undermine a civil and engaged society marked by trust and respect. Indeed, it's increasingly obvious that the manner in which governments determine programmes of financial support and public services deliver them too often actually reinforces the perception of social exclusion which they're actually seeking to address. In other words, what you've got are well-intentioned programmes, whether they're delivered directly by public servants or by caseworkers of contracted not-for-profit organisations, well-intentioned programmes that frequently create helplessness and dependence and undermine self-reliance and control. In providing financial support, they actually undermine the creation of social capital and feed a sense of powerlessness. Huge problem. The second big problem I see is how governments increasingly seek to influence the behaviour of citizens in socially beneficial ways, so that, for example, they smoke less, or eat healthily, or save more, or have sex safely, or use less energy, or conserve water, or look after their families responsibly, or act respectfully. And governments, of course, want to do this because if the behaviours don't change, the costs to the public purse and the cost of public well-being are going to increase exponentially. So these two issues, I think, which underpin so much contemporary social policy, can't be resolved, I don't think, within the traditional linearities and hierarchies of public administration. Citizens, in one way or another, need to be placed in joint control, which is why in Australia both Commonwealth and state governments are trialling, often as pilots, new case-based and place-based approaches to service delivery. Many of you who have been invited to this conference have been invited precisely because those are the areas in which you're working. Whether it's individualised funding of the delivery of disability services, pioneered in Western Australia more than a decade ago, and now being picked up in various manifestations with varying levels of zeal in many other states. Whether it's the Commonwealth's new Jobs Fund, with its focus on place-based initiatives to get communities working and create infrastructure at the local level. Whether it's the new Securing Jobs for Your Future initiative in Victoria, or the commitment to establish independent schools in Western Australia, which are both initiatives based on providing greater choice and responsibility and placing it in the hands of trainees and students and parents. Other initiatives, like the Commonwealth's Communities for Children initiative, which since 2004 has been delivering a community-based model for improving outcomes for young children, which builds on consultation and flexibility and latitude and innovation. Whether it's Centrelink's new place-based initiative to provide personal services brokerage for young refugee job seekers, founded at the local level, based on collaboration and partnership, informed by participatory action research. Initiatives like the establishment in Victoria of an office for the community sector to work supportively and facilitate, and in a facilitative fashion, with community organisations. The Commonwealth's Personal Helpers and Mentors program, which provides recovery workers to listen and to act and empower those who struggle day in and day out with mental illness. I can think of another 10 to 20 initiatives happening at the Commonwealth and state level. Much is happening. But can I be honest? I think much of it is small in scale, is fragmentary in nature, is often poorly funded, it is very often time limited. Most important, so many of these initiatives at the moment are inadequately framed in terms of political philosophy. Vitality of reform, much of which sits with you, seems to me at least still to sit at the periphery of public administration. So, can things change? Yes, they can. Technology, especially the increased access to and use of social media, will, as Martin Stewart Weeks has argued, be a catalyst for Government 2.0. It may even be a driver of it, can certainly impact not only in enabling new communities of shared information, but in influencing political debate. Its power to transact government has barely been touched. However, technology cannot create new and collaborative forms of government if the traditional asymmetries of power are not addressed. Part of the solution is to ensure that not-for-profit organisations are given the opportunity to be engaged at a higher level of the public sector value chain, not just as grant supplicants or contracted outsourced providers, but given a real opportunity to contribute to the policies that inform the programmes and given the opportunity to negotiate the administrative guidelines on how those programmes are going to be delivered. They need to be actively encouraged and supported to explore new ways of delivering public policy, to innovate publicly and socially. Essentially, in my view, public services, your public services, should establish the outcomes to be sought and the transparent reporting that is required for public accountability purposes, and then get out of the way. But engaging with community organisations isn't a panacea. It's got its own dangers. It's important to recognise that non-profit community organisations may unwittingly become part of the problem. I think it's unfair to portray not-for-profit deliverers simply as arms of government. For most of these organisations, their mission may have drifted, but for most of them, their goals and values remain strong. Nevertheless, the fact is that they can together join with public servants in creating an unholy alliance of professional knowledge and power. Too often, those communities and those individuals who believe they've got the ability to manage their own contribution to society and do so voluntarily, find that their co-contribution to public policy, their capacity to make their own decisions, is stymied at every turn by those who seek to act in their best interests. Of course, those citizens who have a disability or a long-term health problem or suffer mental illness, those citizens who are looking for work or training or seeking the best education for their children, of course they need professional help, although I must say that the social media now creates the opportunity to share knowledge and good practice across distance in real time without the intervention of the state. In short, network governance requires both community organisations and public services to make their role over. And so, by discursive perambulation to the question of how the organisational capability of public services needs to be improved, I'd suggest that at least two fundamental aspects need to change: structure and culture, which lie at the centre of the traditional public service and at the heart of its failure. First, the traditional hierarchies that have represented archetypal bureaucracy for so long will have to be confronted with revolutionary intent. In a world in which communities and individuals are expected and able to exercise greater power, it's the more junior public servant who needs to be given greater status and responsibility. The community-level bureaucrats, the call centre operatives, the front office staff, the public service caseworkers have got to be given far more authority to provide information, to engage with citizens, and to negotiate and coordinate decisions at the local level. Operational agencies, local government authorities, community centres will have to become concomitantly more important. Central agencies, national offices, and executive leadership will become, I hope, less important. Second, the leadership behaviours that accompany situational authority need to be transformed. A greater emphasis needs to be placed on the skills and the emotional intelligence required for collaboration and partnerships. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I continue to believe that in a future world marked by deliberative democracy rather than bureaucratic authority, that even in that world, the public service, a radically transformed public service, will remain important in mediating the relationship between the state and the citizen. Instead of managing contracts for community organisations, you, will need to manage relationships with communities. Sitting at the centre of the public space of communicative action, the role of public servants will be to link grassroots civic engagement with formally constituted political authority. In the language of libertarian paternalism, public servants are going to have a vital role to play in administering government programs that seek to nudge citizens to do what is socially responsible and politically acceptable. In a world in which the nature of policy making and service delivery has been profoundly reinterpreted, and in which the actions of the governments are co-produced by users and their communities, public servants, I think, will remain at the epicentre of multi-stakeholder networks. The leadership skills they require, the leadership skills that you and those who work with you will require, will be those of communication, resource mobilisation, negotiation. The power you continue to wield will be to enable individual citizens and their communities of place and interest to play a larger role in shaping the decisions that affect them through new forms of participatory democracy and active volunteering. The state, I hope, will be hollowed out. The citizen, I trust, will be empowered. Governments will set new directions. The public services will be made over. In this revolutionary concept of public service, the public servant will need to be a new person, able to exert more influence, but willing to impose less direct authority. Her strength will be the power to persuade. His ability will be the capacity to inform and support. Their role will be to suggest and to assist and to mentor and to evaluate and to monitor. Their ambition as public